The footman was the first to know that Lady Ellingham's prized Pomeranian had not, in fact, run away during the gala, but had instead succumbed to an unfortunate encounter with an unsecured shrimp tower. This, however, was not the sort of knowledge one listed proudly on a resume, especially in the silver-plated world of Gilded Age mansions. Number. Below stairs, secrets were currency, and footmen, maids, butlers, and scullery workers kept the bank of gossip richer than the Vanderbilts' breakfast porridge, which was heavy on the cream and light on the oats. Let's slip quietly now into one of those grand homes, the kind with 40 rooms and 15 chimneys, and an entire wing devoted solely to embroidery and social misunderstandings. The kind of place where the wallpaper cost more than a carriage horse and the chandeliers had their own cleaning butler. Genuine position, chandelier butler. Polishing crystal teardrops required tremendous optimism and a ladder taller than most. Good marriages. In households like these, everything glittered, except, of course, the servants. Yet they saw all. They were the internal organs of domestic grandeur, pumping information instead of blood, digesting scandal with admirable discretion, and occasionally twitching involuntarily when the lady of the house ordered aspic shaped like a swan. Again, above stairs, life was dominated by calling cards, corsets, and a near-pathological obsession with placement of forks, chairs, flower arrangements, and people. Guests were social starch. You arranged them just so. Below stairs, life was dominated by bells. Wired through the walls like nerves, those little buzzers chimed at all hours, each one signaling a noble whim. The bells had names, or rather, they had designations. Drawing room, master bedroom, library annex, Lady Margaret's hideous yellow sitting room. Each one summoned a servant to somewhere, for something, immediately. And yet, it wasn't all misery and polish. Servants, by necessity and proximity, became students of human absurdity. They observed everything, including which houseguest drank from the finger bowls, and which gentlemen swore like dockhands when they thought no one was listening. When Mrs. Houghton Belvedere insisted, for the 13th time, that her fainting spells were due to a high artistic sensitivity to reality, and not the brandy her maid watered down, you can be sure there were giggles in the kitchen. That kitchen, by the way, was sweltering. In many Gilded Age homes, it was downstairs and back around several confusing corridors, intended to keep the aroma of real life far from the noses of guests. A cook reigned supreme there, armed with cleavers and contempt. Other servants might whisper about household affairs. The cook, however, thundered. If the bread came out wrong, someone's soul might be questioned. Scone inspections could feel like spiritual audits. A junior maid, young, small enough to dodge, clumsy, aristocratic elbows, and perpetually covered in lint, would often be first to clean the day's parlor. There, she might find dropped fans and forgotten notes, twisted mourning brooches with questionable hair origins, or, on one memorable occasion, an earring that certainly did not belong to the Baroness, but did shimmer with the familiar excess of her husband's mistress. The maid turned it in, naturally. She wasn't paid to provoke duels. Butlers stood at the apex of this domestic pyramid, with their own rules, wardrobes, and tone of voice best described as funeral but confident. A good butler could hear a clink of spoon against saucer and know whether the guest was enjoying their tea or secretly resenting the invitation. Their greatest skill, however, was presence, being both essential and invisible, like oxygen, or a very polite ghost with impeccable posture. And then there were valets and ladies' maids, the confidants of corseted secrets. They knew who stuffed silk bustles with paper to increase the drama, and who sharpened snide remarks in the mirror before descending to dinner. At night, these servants unbuttoned, unlaced, unpinned, and occasionally listened to gentle weeping or enthusiastic pillow talk, muffled by many yards of damask. Yes, if you want to know the truth of the Gilded Age, you don't ask the host. Ask the person who ironed their undergarments. So, as we wander quietly through these grand corridors with their velvet curtains and suspiciously empty bird cages, let's remember, every puffed sleeve was adjusted by weary hands, and every glittering soiree was shadowed by watchful eyes, dusting in silence behind doors discreetly ajar. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, let the parquet floors creak gently behind us. The trouble with opulence is that it doesn't know how to whisper. Gilded Age mansions were less about comfortable charm and more about ensuring any visiting European nobility experienced whiplash from sheer overstated wealth. Marble staircases that could be mistaken for small mountain ranges, ballrooms large enough to lose a pony, gold leaf on everything that stayed still for more than 7 seconds, including, on one noted occasion, a stuffed peacock perched above the fireplace at the Astor residence. Truly, nothing says refinement quite like gilding a bird that's already gaudy. But behind the velvet curtains and under the hand-knotted Persian carpets, there moved a secret world of whispers and perfectly polished shoes. The servants, the butlers, the parlor maids and footmen, the cooks and scullery maids who saw it all, but strictly did not comment, at least not within earshot of the drawing room. To truly understand what servants saw behind closed doors, we must sneak, silently, of course, and wearing softly soled slippers, through the back stairwells of these great homes. You see, every Gilded Age mansion had two personalities, the glittering, chandelier-whispering facade, and the humming, slightly flower-dusted world below stairs. Let us then tiptoe into one such house. It is no particular house, and all houses at once. A titanic Newport summer cottage, built by a banker whose only real hobby was constructing Greek temples full of highly breakable porcelain. Down in the servants' hall, a dim, surprisingly busy place that always smelled faintly of ironing starch and overcooked cabbage. It was all schedules and secrets. The head butler, a steely-eyed gentleman named Mr. Little, who knew every family scandal going back 3 generations, ran the staff like an admiral commanding a very polite naval fleet made of dusters and finger sandwiches. Mr. Little was a relic of another era, even in his own day. He ironed the morning newspaper before presenting it to the master of the house, a ritual as precise as a religious ceremony. Heaven forbid the master's fingers encounter a wrinkle in the Times. That would surely be grounds for diplomatic incident. Now, upstairs, the family drama was often subtle. A misdirected love letter, a faint standoff over a mismatched dinner fork at a 12-course meal. But down below, the servants saw every crack in the plaster of perfection. Take, for instance, Lady Winifred's fondness for nightcaps. Not the silky caps worn to bed, but the kind served in a crystal glass. From the buttery shadows of the hallway, a maid named Clara would see Lady Winifred glide across the marble in feathered slippers at midnight, hunting the liquor cabinet like a glamorous raccoon. Not a word was ever said, save for Clara's frequent note to the cook in the morning. Extra coffee and eggs, strong as regret. The wardrobes were another source of gentle staff amusement. Mr. Bartholomew, the second son who fancied himself a poet, would spend an hour selecting the perfect cravat. His valet, whose name history has not preserved, though we will call him Franklin, as it suits, would observe silently as Mr. Bartholomew rejected one shade of blue as too maritime, and another as insinuating something about my character I don't care for. Franklin, who likely owned 2 suits and a poetry collection he never dared show anyone, gave no opinion. But privately, he preferred the aubergine. The servants, you see, were always watching. Not maliciously, not even curiously, really, but out of necessity. They observed to anticipate, to prepare, to avoid catastrophe, dressed in satin and impatience. They were the custodians of calm, the silent air traffic controllers of debutante dramas and bridal crises. the footmen who kept mental maps of every guest's allergies, the housemaids who knew which vases always fell over in a strong breeze and which guests borrowed small silver items, accidentally. And though they were expected to be invisible, they saw everything. From the top-floor guest who stuffed sandwiches into a reticule for later, to the time Congressman Breckinridge mistook a Greek urn for a chamber pot. Though to be fair, lighting was poor and the labeling ambiguous. The staff were present for every glittering faux pas. So as you drift now, softly and slowly, toward that drowsy velvet realm just past half asleep, imagine those silent footfalls on polished floors, the gentle click of teacups, the swish of a polished shoe on marble, a world behind the grandeur, patiently watching the golden chaos unfold. And what, you may wonder, did these keepers of order do when all the guests had gone home and the chandelier finally stopped swaying? Well, that is another winding hallway entirely, in the marbled entrails of Gilded Age mansions, where chandeliers glittered like frostbitten stars and velvet curtains fell with Gothic theatricality. The help moved like silent footnotes in a novel they were never meant to read. Beneath the splendor, below the parquet floors polished to a supernatural shine, nestled a parallel universe, more clockwork than couture. Here, in the underworld of dumbwaiters and coal chutes, the servants lived, not just in quarters, but in service. A valet might know more of a man's secrets than his own wife. A lady's maid could untangle reputations alongside corsets. And on this particular evening, with the gaslight era humming like a half-remembered waltz, cozy candlelight danced across kitchen tiles in the mansion of the Winslows, a family so wealthy that their dog's collar had its own butler. At the heart of the house's operation was Mrs. Penelope Huckins, the housekeeper. She was stern, starch-necked, and moved with such authority among the staff that one suspected she had once been an admiral's spy who'd pivoted careers. She possessed the uncanny ability to detect an improperly laid oyster, fork at 20 paces, and the patience to train a new footman without ever raising her voice above the decibel of a sigh. The younger maids, especially Snow-Pale Beatrice from Vermont, could hardly believe the speed at which this woman could recount every silver teaspoon in the house, most of which had names and specific personalities according to her. "Don't let little Algernon get too close to the sardines," was a real piece of guidance given during the infamous luncheon of '89. In the butler's pantry, just between the wine cellar and an entirely unnecessary hallway that existed only to display tapestries no one could name, two footmen were engaged in the ancient and noble art of whispering juicy gossip while pretending to polish decanters. "I heard," said Thomas with great solemnity, his hand barely moving across the glass, "that the master of the house chose his new carriage not for its comfort, but because it made Lord Peebles green with envy." "That's ridiculous," Alfred responded, deeply offended on behalf of all things logical. "He chose it because the wheels matched his dog's eyes." And they both nodded, because both things could be true in the Gilded Age. Above them, in drawing rooms perfumed with power and potpourri, the Winslow family clinked glasses next to hand-painted murals of mythological figures doing dramatic things in togas. But what those noble Romans never knew, if you asked Cook, whose opinions on such things were uncommonly specific, is that they would have absolutely hated the odors coming from the plumbing system. Indoor plumbing was still a novelty, you see, and the pipes tended to gurgle like discontented phantoms at inopportune moments, such as when negotiating dowries or playing an especially intense hand of whist. Down below, preparations for tomorrow's breakfast began before anyone's supper had ended. Coffee beans were ground by hand, eggs arranged in cruelly symmetrical pyramids, and an entire army of spoons counted, recounted, and then counted again by a scullery maid with a passion for numbers and a deep distrust of gravity. This kitchen ballet, as it was half affectionately called, was a finely tuned performance where each player knew their cue. The footman with the boots, the boot boy with the polish with the smell that would linger in the hallway for days. Everything choreographed right down to the errant squeak of floorboards beneath the cook's indignant pacing. Yes, servants saw things. They saw who crept where after midnight, who decanted brandy with far too liberal a tilt, and who insisted their dog understood Latin. They learned to listen with the discreet deafness of consummate professionals, and to remember just enough to be valuable, but never dangerous. And as the moon cast borrowed light across slate rooftops and glass conservatories, and the fireplace embers whispered their final glowing secrets, Alfred the footman prepared the cigars for the breakfast tray, not because anyone would want a cigar with their porridge, but because the master occasionally liked to glance at one thoughtfully. Little did Alfred know, the morning would bring not just porridge and cigar glancing, but a scuffle over a misbuttoned waistcoat and an incident involving a duck that had wandered in from a guest's carriage. But that, dear dreamer, floats gently toward us, feather by feather, in the quiet promise of morning's whisper, even at the height of industrial splendor, with chandeliers that twinkled like 1,000 tiny, gas-powered stars and bathtubs filled by teams of dedicated housemaids. One truth held steady in Gilded Age mansions. The more absurd the luxury, the more suspiciously ordinary the problem. Take, for instance, the matter of jelly glasses. Now, we are not referring to spectacles made of preserves, though one imagines old Mr. Astor might have tried them had jelly-based optics become fashionable. No, jelly. Glasses were the small cups used to serve fruit jellies, flans, and other wobbly miracles of Victorian dessert engineering. And each one, in a grand estate like the Vanderbilts or the McLeans, had to match perfectly. And so the servant's day might begin not with polishing silver or arranging Lady So-and-so's Turkish slippers by ascending size and moral virtue, but with panic over a missing jelly cup. Imagine one glass shy of a full set, and suddenly your whole career hangs on the brink. No pressure, Jenkins. Just find that jelly glass, or never work in Newport again. Despite immense wealth, many of these households resembled Baroque machines balancing on thin air. A veritable army of staff, housemaids, scullery maids, footmen, valets, butlers, upstairs maids, downstairs maids, and the occasional dietitian brought in to negotiate with Madame's famously petulant digestion, operated the place. Each had a defined territory and incalculable rules. For example, a footman who dared to open a window in the library, a room off limits to his kind, could look forward to a strongly worded dismissal, and possibly a blacklisting that stretched from Newport to the Upper West Side. Window opening, you see, was the sacred domain of a specific class of under-butler or upper maid, depending on barometric pressure and the likelihood of drafts affecting Lady Duff Gordon's nerves. Then there were the bells. Oh, the bells. Mansions in the Gilded Age were laced with elaborate bell systems, tangles of wires and pulleys running like secret veins through the walls, designed to summon staff from any corner of the estate. The drawing room bell jingled 3 times. The boudoir bell let out an offended ring-pause ring, which carried strongly accusatory tones. The morning room bell was flamboyant and urgent, while the bell for the solarium had the especially cruel quirk of sounding remarkably like a cow's distant moo, leading many new maids into wild goose chases through the greenhouses. Each bell struck fear into the hearts of servants, not because the work was particularly terrifying, but because nothing disrupted the illusion of effortless grace, like a butler getting the wrong ring and showing up in the billiard room instead of the smoking room with only a decanter and no cigars. That sort of mistake could cost you the gold-plated keys to the second liquor cabinet. Now, amidst all this high society orchestration, there lived a small ceremony known discreetly among the servants as the pudding talk. The pudding talk took place exactly once per week, just after luncheon on Thursdays, or possibly Fridays, depending on the lunar calendar and Lady Fairchild's lumbago. It was then that the kitchen staff, still flushed from the aggressive steam of 12 dozen lunch courses, would convene at the far edge of the service corridor to discuss what pudding the household would be presented next Tuesday. Make no mistake, gentle listener. This was not idle chatter. The pudding committee, formed of the cook, the second cook, the pastry maid, and a judgmental carrot-chopping boy named Arthur, determined the pudding course as if they were planning the Peace of Versailles. Arguments would erupt over blancmange versus jam roly-poly. The merits of treacle tart would be weighed against the sensitivities of Master Richard's delicate constitution. Sometimes there was espionage. Once, a rival footman from a neighboring mansion, jealous of the social ripple an orange fool had caused, attempted to swap it last minute with stewed prunes. He was found out, of course, whispered about behind heavy parlour drapes for years. And yet, through all of this, the glass hunts, the bell-induced migraines, the pudding diplomacy, servants bore witness to something else entirely. They became the archivists of private moments, observers of whispered arguments behind monogrammed doors, silent companions to stifle giggles from debutantes, caught sneaking extra gooseberry fool. They saw the human behind the silk, and before long, the still, watchful eyes downstairs began to detect something more peculiar, something moving beneath the velvet layers of privilege in a certain guest room no one ever seemed to clean. In the grand halls of Newport and the opulent drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue, silver didn't polish itself, and the masters of gilded fortune, well, they rarely ventured past their morning tea, let alone into the scullery. That left the heavy lifting, quite literally, to the countless servants who kept these fantastical estates from melting into chaos like decorative butter pats on a summer day. And among these unsung heroes, drifting through marble corridors in starched cotton and silent shoes, there existed one particular class of servant with eyes everywhere: the footmen. Now, footmen weren't just butlers in waiting or glorified handymen. No, they were ornaments with lungs, chosen as much for their height, posture, and impressively symmetrical calves as for their ability to manage duties like wine service or door opening. Footmen were the human equivalents of bronze candelabras, except with daydreams, the occasional backache, and a strong opinion on the correct way to decant claret. They wore livery, trimmed in gold braid, upper class in appearance but very much stationed on the downstairs side of the social ladder. To the lady of the house, they were a visual symbol of her husband's wealth. To the cook, they were always late for kitchen errands. But to the other servants, footmen were the unofficial narrators of the household, silent witnesses to scandal, anxiety, and the curious human opera unfolding in fine upholstery and fainting couches. Footmen stood behind dinner guests as they bickered politely over fish forks. They drifted through parlors, dusting figurines during nervous family meetings. They carried in handwritten notes from secret admirers. And once, on a memorably foggy afternoon in 1892, one footman claimed to have caught young Mr. Abbott of New Rochelle practicing his eloquence to a potted fern. The fern, we are told, took it rather well, and though always comparing wages, not enough, coats, too tight, and staircases, far too many, the footmen grew quietly astute. They knew where the Countess kept her sherry, regardless of what she told the doctor. They knew that high society balls required more orchestration than most naval battles, especially when Lady Evangeline insisted all 12 of her dogs parade in matching silk ribbons during the entree course. The footmen weren't alone in their observations. The housemaids were always watching too, though the view from their soap bubble-streaked windows was perhaps a shade more acidic. Still, it was the footmen who assembled the daily episodes of what some referred to as polite catastrophe theatre. They whispered of Mrs. Pembroke's fourth nervous breakdown, brought on, apparently, by a missing diamond hairpin later found in the pastry flour. They noted the Duke of Coldfield's habit of humming off-key waltzes to his monocle before dinner. They remembered which heiresses practiced fainting when unchaperoned. But more than scandal, they watched civilization balancing on high-button shoes and crumbling etiquette. They marveled at how men who couldn't boil an egg could spend $12,000 on doorknobs, or that grown adults genuinely believed one must never eat peas with a knife unless one had been raised by wolves, or worse, in Ohio. There were also moments of kindness. A whispered thank you from the trembling debutante who tripped on the ballroom steps. A cigar passed along by a tipsy dowager who couldn't remember if she'd already fired them or not. And so, the footman kept going, tending fires, opening carriages, announcing guests, and deciphering glances sharper than grandfather's hunting cutlery. In their tucked-away bedrooms, usually in attics or windowless second floors, they scribbled notes, composed verses, or simply dozed with sore legs and odd dreams of being addressed by their proper names. It wasn't a life of riches, but it was a life of stories. Some sweet, like a secret letter in a locket. Others, sticky and tart like marmalade gone slightly rogue. And tomorrow, there would be silver to polish down to its last smug gleam, and a secret to carry just deep enough in the pockets of a tailored coat. But tonight, the mansions breathed quiet in their velvet lungs. The footman slept with polished shoes by the door, dreaming of staircases without landings, and always listening. In another wing of the estate, however, the maids were just beginning their whisper shift. Meanwhile, in the butter-soft silence between luncheon and tea, the servants of Gilded Age mansions navigated their own shadowy symphony of rituals, strictly choreographed, rarely congratulated, and, occasionally, delightfully absurd. Take, for instance, the solemn rite of bed-making. One would think it as simple as pulling up the covers. But this was the Gilded Age, when pillow arrangement was practically an architectural style. At one estate in Newport, a housekeeper insisted the pillows be arranged in the stepped pyramid style. 2 large ones at the base, 2 medium in the middle, and one, almost comically, small pillow, poised like a cherry on top. It wasn't to be slept on. It was, in unclear terms, decorative, although guests suspected it was more of a small, passive-aggressive protest from the staff. Indeed, the upper-crust bedrooms were temples of ritual. Each morning, maids would enter the chambers of their employers at the strike of 7, always 7, never before. Heaven forbid. The first, lightest knock was the warning. The second was barely a suggestion. And the third? Well, if one had to reach a third knock, someone would later receive a note written carefully on personal stationery and probably scented just slightly with disapproval. The beds themselves were marvels. Hand-carved mahogany headboards that could double as medieval fortresses if necessary, mattresses stuffed with horsehair, or if you were really someone, with feathers shipped from Alsace, and a quantity of linens that gave even seasoned launderers pause. The servants would smooth every wrinkle with surgical precision, using hot flat irons, not only on clothes, but on the very bed sheets, a practice that temporarily turned the linen closet into a minor sauna. And let us not forget the hot water bottle ballet. In those drafty mansions, where heat was a luxury that rarely climbed to the guest wing, warming beds was a crucial job. Each footman or housemaid was assigned a flock of hot water bottles to deploy before guests retired. These copper or ceramic comrades were slipped under the covers with the elegance of a magician doing sleight of hand, and extracted just as stealthily. Accounts survive of footmen who took such pride in their hot bottle timing that they swore they could make a feather tremble on a pillow without waking a soul. One even considered patenting his technique until he discovered patents did not exist for extreme gentleness. If the bed-making was a ceremonial affair, then serving breakfast in bed was the crown jewel performance. A silver tray, always polished so vigorously that some footmen confessed to seeing their future as butlers reflected in it, was used to carry tea, toast, eggs, marmalade, and the New York Times, with the lower quarter folded up demurely to make for easier reading without smearing jam across the editorial column. Every tray had to be perfectly balanced, not just physically, but existentially. Too much toast, and you were suggesting the lady had a hearty appetite. Not done. Too little, and you might trigger a fainting spell halfway through a eulogy for Cleopatra's jewelry and the arts. A section. Those who did it well were quietly revered. A breakfast-in-bed champion at the Vanderbilt estate was once said to have arranged a tray so harmonious it made a guest weep softly into her eggs Florentine. But among the many servants toiling behind these doors was one group with a singular power: the lady's maid. Equal parts stylist, therapist, and multilingual detective, the lady's maid had access to everything from silken secrets to tear-stained letters hastily tucked beneath the vanity mirror. She would brush out hair for exactly 100 strokes, produce hairpins as if by sorcery, and possess an uncanny knowledge of which corset caused fainting and which simply encouraged it. It was whispered in brown hallways and faintly dust-scented servant quarters that the lady's maid knew more family secrets than the family did. She heard murmurs at the window, caught glances in the looking glass, and occasionally had to pretend not to notice a certain gentleman's walking stick reappearing a little too early in the west corridor. And yet, despite the hierarchy and the hush of it all, it was in these quiet rooms, the bedrooms, the boudoir, the dressing chambers, that the servants began to see the cracks in the grand facades. A lipstick smudge on the wrong handkerchief, a boutonniere tucked under the wrong name, or the curious matter of the locked drawer that was quite impossibly unlocked just last Tuesday. But that is a tale best whispered over a cooling cup of tea in the servants' quarters, just as the first bell rings for dinner. And if you listen closely, you might just catch the soft shuffle of a footman's shoes passing outside the wine cellar door. Curious, isn't it? Perhaps next, we'll head below ground, where the real orchestration began, as dawn attempted to slip shyly through the velvet drapes of the drawing room. Most of the mansion still slept, draped in silence and carefully pressed bed linens. But below, stairs, in the dependable hum of the servants' quarters, life was already several teacups deep. To the outside world, the Gilded Age was a diamond-draped spectacle, ballrooms clinking with champagne flutes and opera boxes filled with monocles and scandal. But the true orchestrators of this shiny illusion were already dusting marble busts before anyone upstairs so much as blinked into a sunbeam. Take Mr. Townsend's mansion, for instance, a sprawling Italianate behemoth nestled on Fifth Avenue, with a portico designed to impress visiting archdukes and the occasional fur-clad railroad baroness. Upstairs, damask wallpapers, red velvet fainting sofas, and more silverware than anyone ever reasonably needed, including several mysterious spoons that appeared to serve no culinary purpose. Downstairs, however, was an entirely different kind of kingdom, one ruled not by wealth, but by routine. The housekeeper, Mrs. Plunkett, moved through this underworld with all the solemnity of a cathedral bell, her skirts rustling like pages in a prayer book. She had memorized not only the correct order for polishing each of the mansion's 34 doorknobs, but also which member of the family preferred their boiled egg coddled versus more sternly poached. She could stare down a new footman with such holy authority that even the most self-assured butler trembled slightly at the mention of her name. And yet, for all the discipline, life below stairs had its charm. Perhaps the most beloved corner of the servants' quarters was the butler's pantry, which was not a pantry at all, but rather a sort of sacred shrine to silver polish and whispered gossip. There, footmen practiced the fine art of eavesdropping while appearing terribly busy with cutlery. Though they could have earned honorary degrees in vocal memory, no one was ever foolish enough to repeat a family secret aloud, unless, of course, it was delightfully mundane, like how Master Reginald had recently been caught trimming his moustache with a letter opener, or how Lady Townsend secretly fed buttered crumpets to her prized greyhound, Miss Elspeth, under the table during formal dinners. The cook, meanwhile, an Irish woman named Nora O'Shea, held dominion over the kitchen like a general with a wooden spoon. She maintained a consistent state of benevolent irritation, especially when tasked with preparing something unnecessarily elaborate, like oyster aspic molded into the shape of Napoleon's hat. Why anyone wanted gelatinous seafood resembling a 19th century military accessory remained unclear. "Because the lady read about it in Household Monthly," remarked Nora once, peering dubiously into a quivering mold and muttering, "May the good Lord preserve us from magazines." Despite long hours and relentless formality, there was laughter among the linen closets and behind the swinging doors. There were poker games during late-night shifts in the scullery, where crusts of high society, pâté, were transformed into dubious snacks. There were whispered romances sparked during coal shoveling duties or over the shared agony of ironing a 7-layer crinoline skirt. Even mischief had its day, like the time young scullery maid Lottie started a mild ghost rumor to delay spring cleaning of the 3rd floor. To this day, no one's quite sure if the portrait of great-uncle Thaddeus actually blinked. And of course, there was Marmalade, the one-eyed cat who had simply appeared one rainy Thursday and proceeded to install himself as unofficial morale officer. No one fed him formally, but he mysteriously grew plumper, testifying to a robust secret spoonful of scraps passed hand to pocket when no one was looking. Marmalade once even strolled into a dinner party upstairs, perched atop a serving cart carrying lobster soufflé. It was both his most daring and most applauded outing. The guests were charmed. The butler less so. Marmalade was unrepentant. Life below stairs was a masterclass in silent observation. Servants, with their eyes keen and conversations measured, knew who received secret letters and who always left one earring behind. They noticed the shift in mood when a certain visitor arrived, the anxious rustle of silk in the corridor, or the sudden redecorating of the red guest room after a discreet departure. But most importantly, they carried these secrets like lace-wrapped parcels, delicate, unspoken, sometimes a little dusty. The house itself, breathing through its wallpaper and echoing floorboards, seemed to hum with the gossip that never quite made it into the history books. And so, as the clock chimed discreetly near the servants' entrance, never loud enough to disturb the upstairs slumber, the rhythms of daily invisibility resumed. Boots were cleaned. Silver glowed. And the house began to wake. Somewhere upstairs, Lady Townsend rang for her tea. Downstairs, Mrs. Plunkett double-checked the butter. And somewhere in the corridor, near the library, Marmalade was already plotting his next daring escapade. As the house stirred to life once more, the mysteries of the drawing room beckoned gently. And soon, we shall step quietly toward another set of curious footsteps. Behind another elegant embroidered curtain, there was a curious symphony that played out in the shadows of every grand Gilded Age mansion. Not the kind with violins and crystal chandeliers, though of course there were plenty of those, but the quiet, clockwork rhythm of a house running itself like a backstage opera. Nowhere did the unseen gears spin so cleverly as in the butler's pantry. Ah yes, the butler's pantry. Perhaps the most dignified corner cupboard ever to exist. It sat tucked between the dining room and the kitchen, a narrow, polished little sanctum where silver teapots were burnished to shine brighter than a Vanderbilt's dinner guest's. It was equal parts sacred vault and gossip observatory, a kind of Switzerland, in between the chaos of the kitchen and the theatrics of the table. Inside, the head butler held dominion, part priest, part secret agent, and full-time steward of silver and secrets. Take Mr. Percival Etheridge, for example, the duke-like butler of the Hartford Pendleton estate, with a moustache so neat it could have been used as a ruler, and a voice like newly ironed linen. Mr. Etheridge maintained a level of decorum that could make even diamonds feel underdressed. He managed more than just cutlery. He managed affairs of state. Miniature ones, of course, like where Mrs. Pendleton's prized oyster forks had wandered off to, always found in the same drawer the cook insisted was absolutely not the oyster fork drawer, and ensuring that the heirloom meerschaum pipe, pretending to be ornamental in the study, did not go walkabout during the senator's Thursday poker games. The butler's pantry wasn't just a hallway of drawers, it was fitted with a small sink, a warming oven, for dishes, and walls lined with velvet-lined shelves where crystal glasses arranged themselves like transparent aristocrats in alphabetical order of function. Aperitif glasses, sherry glasses, glasses for toasting naval victories even if one had never seen a boat. Servants passed through this hallowed ground like monks in a monastery, always entering respectfully, and ideally not while the butler was practicing his "yes, madam" look in the mirror, which, incidentally, he perfected while polishing the silver chalices. The expression was one part humility, one part mild amusement, the art of making someone feel important while not laughing at their request for ice with its own napkin. Then there was the silverware journal, a real thing in the most fastidious households. A little leather-bound logbook, not meant for poetic musings, unless your idea of literature includes one Sheffield fish knife missing, presumed lent to salad service. Page after page, each entry as stern and specific as a Puritan sermon. Mr. Etheridge's penmanship was so flawless, he referred to ink smudges as a personal failing. But this was more than bureaucracy. It was protection. Silver had a tendency to disappear, especially around ambitious young footmen or the occasional cousin who fancied himself a collector of historic cutlery. And if it wasn't being pocketed, it was being misused. The horror of watching a pickle fork used for deviled eggs, enough to make a butler's monocle quiver. What servants saw from the butler's pantry was, in essence, the entire ballet of the household, performed through the crack of a door, reflected in the backing of a soup spoon. Every flirtation over consommé, every snub disguised as a toast, every time the lady of the house raised an eyebrow to signal she'd had quite enough talk of railroad bonds. Thank you. And just beyond the pantry was the dining room, glittering with candlelight and starched expectations. This was the arena where social wars were waged delicately over 10-course meals, and where servants had to be as invisible as breath and twice as efficient. If the soup was late, the butler felt it like a thunderclap down to his shoe buckles. But if everything shimmered just right, if the silver reflected perfectly the china's gold rim, and no one noticed the soup had been made twice because the cook forgot the bay leaves, then Mr. Etheridge would retreat briefly to his pantry, allow himself 2 bites of ham on toast, and smile privately at the night's quiet success. He knew, as all good butlers did, that sometimes the finest service was the art of being entirely forgotten. And speaking of service, elsewhere in the mansion, someone else was quietly serving something far less elegant, something sticky, smelly, and inexplicably tracked in from the garden. The chambermaid's troubles were only just beginning. There was a particular kind of hush that drifted through the hallways of Gilded Age mansions in the mid-afternoon, when the guests were picnicking by the lake. The lady of the house was fainting gracefully onto a chaise longue, and the upstairs maids were finally able to stop pretending they didn't notice the silver umbrella stand wobbling each time someone walked past it. During this lull, the servants of these palatial estates often slipped into quieter tasks, polishing banisters till they squeaked with complaint, rearranging flower arrangements until the roses had existential crises, or, more daringly, wandering ever so slightly beyond their assigned duties. You see, the line between servant and silent observer was as blurry as the lace on Mrs. Astor's 30th handkerchief of the day. Servants, by virtue of proximity, witnessed the full theatre of aristocratic life, and often did so while balancing tea trays heavier than a baby grand piano. Take, for example, a butler named Cyril, stationed at a mansion in Newport, though I shall spare you the real name, because the family whose shoes he polished for 18 years liked to sue more than they liked to whisper scandal. Cyril had a calm demeanour, the kind that could pour sherry for quarrelling dinner guests without flinching, and his moustache was trained to twitch only in the presence of outright treason. Cyril learned to absorb the nuances of upper-class mood swings the way a barometer absorbs atmospheric pressure, a sudden craving for quail's eggs on a Wednesday. That meant Lady Wexley was furious about something, an off-key rendition of "Oh, Promise Me" from the upstairs corridor. Lord Wexley had been drinking before luncheon again, but on one breezy spring afternoon, as the house staff scrubbed the brass knobs into a state of spiritual clarity, word filtered through the service corridors that Mistress Beatrice, the lady of the house's niece, had returned early from her tour of Europe, and not alone. She arrived in a flurry of foreign silk, accompanied by a young man with beautifully suspicious cheekbones and an accent that could best be described as seductively unreliable. By the time the footman had informed the housekeeper and the housekeeper had gasped herself into a temporary swoon, Cyril had already prepared the calm the chaos tea tray. Downstairs, the whispers moved faster than toast at a breakfast buffet. The question on every servant's tongue was predictable. Was this monsieur a cousin or a scandal? They got their answer when the lady of the house took one look at the matching rings on the couple's fingers and revived herself with a scream that frightened 2 pugs and an unsuspecting pastry chef. Mistress Beatrice had eloped during her grand tour, a pastime that fell somewhere between studying European art and fleeing personal responsibility. News of the elopement unfurled through the manor like a sunbeam on a cold marble floor. As was customary in these homes, the servants knew the full story within the hour, thanks in large part to Matilda, the lady's maid, who had discovered a monogrammed stocking in the wrong suitcase. Now, elopements among the upper crust could go one of 2 ways. They might be hushed up and forcibly annulled before the ink on the wedding register dried. Or, if it was too late for subtlety, and in this case, it very much was, it became a matter of theatrical acceptance. This required a family dinner with clenched jaws and barely disguised digestives. For such occasions, the servants played their most delicate roles. The valet must not twitch at poorly knotted cravats. The housekeeper must not purse her lips at French syllables spoken too boldly. And the footman with the best grasp of sarcasm must be placed furthest from the table. That night, the grand mahogany table gleamed like scandalous lacquer. The youngest scullery maid was permitted to peek from behind the curtains as Mr. and Mrs. Newlywed attempted small talk over poached halibut, while Lady Wexley clutched her pearls so hard they permanently adopted the shape of her disapproval. Cyril stood immobile, hands clasped behind his back, the reflection of the entire tableau flickering in his polished buttons. He would later remark to the cook that it was the most deliciously awkward fish course since the Duchess of Kenmare accused her cousin of smuggling goat cheese from France. And so the young monsieur was assimilated into the mansion, scandal and all. A week later, he was observed helping Beatrice in the rose garden, translating Rimbaud in a voice that made the gardeners blush. The servants, predictably, placed bets on how long his accent would last. As the spring moon rose, and Beatrice's romantic rebellion settled into something dangerously close to marital normalcy, the mansion exhaled again into its routine of scandals, scones and secrets. And somewhere beyond the quiet shuffle of footfalls and feather dusters, a new piece of gossip was already blossoming among the servants, one that required listening, discretion, and a keen ear pressed gently to the dumbwaiter shaft. The morning bell chimed at Swanswick Manor, a resonant little ding echoing through its 300 rooms like a polite but persistent goose. That bell, mind you, was not for welcoming guests or announcing tea. It was simply the breakfast summons from Mrs. Clarabel Worthington, who must take her eggs at precisely 8:07 a.m. with toast cut in triangles, not squares, and butter that had been aired on the windowsill for exactly 12 minutes, just until it began to question its purpose in life. Downstairs, in the servants' hall, this ritual was met with the resigned reverence of a religious procession. The butler, Mr. Hensley, with a face like a knowing weathered bookshelf, gave one solemn nod. The footmen snapped to attention, each more angular and glassy-eyed than the last, as if carved from spare mahogany. And, beyond them, bustling like orchestrated shadows, were the housemaids, who knew the art of silence better than any grand composer. This particular morning, however, would become known among the downstairs folk as the incident of the unfortunate cravat. Mrs. Worthington's husband, Colonel Percival Worthington, retired, was known less for his military accolades and more for the way he fumbled through daily life like a well-dressed sheep. Though he rarely left the billiards room, he had announced, quite suddenly, that he required his valet, Mr. Triggs, to dress him for a spontaneous brunch with a visiting earl. This caught poor Triggs off guard. Triggs had planned for a restful morning of polishing cufflinks and humming dirges about gout. Instead, He was now wrestling a cravat around the colonel's surprisingly unyielding neck, while the colonel muttered something about how in Prussia they did it with vigor and no complaint. Meanwhile, below stairs, the scullery maid, Jenny, had just discovered a raccoon in the dumbwaiter. She named it Admiral Buttons. It briefly held the rank of assistant footman before being gently guided toward the hedge maze with a saucer of milk and a biscuit. You see, for all their glimmering chandeliers and formal dinners, the Gilded Age elite were in constant danger of their own eccentricities, and it was the servants who bore witness to this theatrical unraveling. They were, in effect, the stagehands of the upper crust's daily performance, dressing the players, moving the sets, and quietly patching over uncouth realities with polished silver and starch. Take, for instance, the lady's maid, Miss Ellaby, whose job it was to ensure that Mrs. Worthington's hair defied gravity each day. Mrs. Worthington's towering coiffure was a feat of engineering as much as fashion, requiring pins, padding, and prayer. Hidden within its elaborately twirled folds was a system of hair rats, little bundles of discarded hair saved to give volume. The staff always wondered whether one of the more ambitious rats might one day become sentient and form a union. In the drawing room, portraits were not merely hung, they were curated, dusted, and sometimes discreetly moved when a guest remembered an awkward affair with an aunt or distant cousin. Behind closed doors, these frames held secrets, letters tucked behind oils, names scraped from painted family trees, and facial features that bore suspicious resemblance to long-gone governesses. Even the grand dining room told tales the help could decipher like another language. A wine stain hastily scrubbed from the brocade runner hinted at both scandal and clumsiness. The rearrangement of place cards told you who had been in favor this week and who was in the proverbial, and once literal, doghouse. But above all, it was the back staircases that caught the real whispers, the ones guests never climbed. Thin and steep, these narrow passages curled through the mansions like veins, built for the invisible circulation of service. Through them moved tea trays, scandal, whispered laughter, and the occasional pug that had wandered astray. It was up one such staircase that Martha, the second housemaid, tiptoed one morning after finding Lord Ellsworth's reading glasses in the fish pond again. She had seen him toss them there while reciting ancient Greek to a statue of Athena. Apparently, the glasses helped the muse. Martha had simply nodded. In the world of Gilded Age domesticity, one didn't question genius. One just dried the spectacles carefully and laid them back on his nightstand beside the half-eaten meringue. And so, as robes rustled and bells tinkled, and somewhere a raccoon plotted a return to the dumbwaiter, life behind the opulent curtains of Swanswick Manor continued its curious rhythm, a gilded symphony conducted by those who served in silence, yet saw everything. Let's dim the lamps a touch and peer now into the ornate laundry room, where thick steam clouds the air and secrets cling gently to the linens. Behind the velvet curtains and beneath the golden chandeliers of Gilded Age mansions, there was yet another underworld entirely, not one of scandal or secrets, for once, but of silver, spoons, and shipping schedules. Yes, tonight we gently descend into the life and times of the butlers, or as some preferred to think of themselves, chief executive officers of cutlery and discretion. You see, the butler was not merely a glorified waiter in a penguin suit, though admittedly the uniform didn't help the image. He was the indispensable nerve center of the household, the all-knowing, silver-polishing, eyebrow-raising oracle, who remembered that Mr. Worthington preferred his oysters clockwise on the plate, and that Mrs. Worthington fainted at the sight of sage green. No one fainted quite like a Worthington. A mansion's butler might oversee dozens of footmen, a fleet of parlour-maid personnel, and a wine cellar delicate enough to trigger diplomatic incidents. The true artistry was in invisibility. The butler was expected to appear only when needed, or better yet, precisely 30 seconds before anyone realized they needed him. When push came to shove, or more accurately, when caviar came to canapé. It was the butler who prevented social catastrophe. There is no recorded case of a butler tackling an earl to prevent him from double-dipping, but we must assume such courage. Most butlers rose through the domestic ranks. They started as hallboys, a job that involved sitting on uncomfortable stools and opening the door all day, every day. On Sundays, they were occasionally allowed to close the door too. Then came footman duty, powdered hair, liveried coats, and standing very, very still for hours in rooms that smelled faintly of swan parté and tension. If they did this without fainting, scandal, or wasting the sherry, they might one day reach the Elysium fields of domestic service, the butler's pantry. The butler's pantry was less of a pantry and more of a command center, half office, half fortress of solitude. It held the silver, the cigars, the brandy, and the secrets. Always the secrets. From clandestine letters to lovelorn heiresses' diary fragments, nothing passed through the household without threading through the butler's mental Rolodex. Some say good butlers kept their employers' secrets. Others say great butlers could forget them entirely. There were butlers trained in the refined arts, such as proper table spacing and impersonating neutrality when hearing guest gossip that could sink a yacht. Others had to master less glamorous skills, like unsticking Lord Witherspoon from an improperly affixed lawn chair during high tea, padding softly through mirrored hallways, polishing candlesticks with the quiet reverence of a monk. He would ensure everything was symmetrical, spotless, and sedate. The china gleamed. The doors opened silently. And if a guest mentioned they preferred lemon in their tea just once, the staff would know it happened on a Tuesday in September during a light drizzle. Butlers were human memory palaces with bow ties, and yet, for all their grace and discretion, butlers had their moments. There were incidents of flamboyant rebellion, some of which involved changing the floral centerpieces without permission, or using the wrong finger bowl on purpose, just to feel alive. One seasoned butler, Mr. Aldridge of Newport, was reported to have yawned softly during the 15th course of an 18-course dinner. It caused quite a stir. 3 debutantes nearly choked on the consommé. But perhaps the butler's most challenging task of all was handling the guest. You know the type. Self-important, over-perfumed, determined to explain the concept of champagne to the French. It was in such company that a butler's true brilliance emerged. With nary a muscle twitch, he could suggest that the music was too loud, the ham was dry, or that someone's monocle was fogging in a most unbecoming manner, all without ever speaking above a whisper. It was said that if a butler ever raised his voice, the walls themselves might apologize. And while lords and ladies came and went, the butler often remained, a stalwart fixture across generations. New wealth might buy a mansion, but it couldn't buy a butler who had thoughts upon it. Entertaining tales tell of new money families wildly unprepared for this. One reportedly asked their butler which fork to use for the caviar-stuffed strawberries. He answered very gently, "None, madam. That dish is best served to the dog." Life in the Gilded Age was a performance, gilded indeed, and the butler was its quiet stage manager, never stealing the spotlight, but ensuring it shined in just the right places. And so, as the grand hall clocks tick softly into the night, and the butler lights one last lantern, for ambience of course, we tiptoe further into the mansion. For just beyond the staircase, something even more peculiar stirs among the footmen. Long before the time of doorbell cameras and politely worded confidentiality agreements, the Gilded Age homeowner had to make do with something far more flawed and far more entertaining: the loyal, underpaid, and frighteningly observant household staff. For in those towering limestone mansions of Fifth Avenue or the rolling lawns of Newport, the walls may have had ears, but it was the footmen who had impeccable memory, and the chambermaids who could rival any private investigator, quietly stationed at the intersection between luxury and lunacy. Nowhere did this insight feel more deliciously absurd than in the sprawling dining rooms, temples of excess where dinner was rarely warm, but always excruciatingly formal. Here, the orchestration of a multi-course meal wasn't just about food. It was theatre. Every fork had a purpose. Every spoon had an attitude. And heaven helped the butler who brought out the fish knives at the oyster course. For a servant during dinner, silence was sacred. But observational comedy was thriving, strictly internal, of course. Bottom buttons were never buttoned on footman livery, a fashion set by King Edward VII, who was, let's put it gently, on friendly terms with food, and the overly tight waistcoats only added to the quiet hilarity. Imagine trying to hold a silver platter aloft while also trying not to faint. Serving was less a job and more an endurance sport. It is said that one particularly flamboyant hostess in New York once hosted a 12-course feast lit entirely by hundreds of tiny, pearl-covered candles floating in finger bowls, a fire hazard masquerading as ambiance. The guests whispered praises. The kitchen staff debated escape routes, but perhaps no room in the house provided more quiet scandal than the dressing room, a peculiar hybrid of salon, sanctuary, and fashion battleground. Here, the maids reigned supreme. Or rather, they served silently while their mistresses recounted their conquests, both romantic and retail. One lady of Pennsylvania Avenue reportedly had a custom-made shoe closet so elaborate it required its own footman, whose sole responsibility was shoe selection. Each morning, he would present a velvet tray of options, like a jeweler displaying diamonds. The maid, however, confided to her sister-in-law that the lady hadn't walked more than 18 feet in public in a decade. All those heels, and never a sidewalk beneath. And let us not forget the sacred ritual of corset lacing. This required two things: patience and absolutely no breathing. One Newport maid wrote in a letter, which she probably shouldn't have, but we're eternally grateful she did, that her mistress demanded to be laced tighter for dinner than for church, as if morality itself were impacted by rib compression. There were entire strategies to corseting. Too loose, and a rival might whisper, too tight, and you'd drop your aspic spoon halfway through the fifth course. Scandal either way. Servants, of course, weren't always stone-faced automatons. In fact, some households came to depend heavily on their discretion and artistic flair. There were stories of valets who doubled as informal therapists, listening to endless sighs about whether Lord this or that would ever propose, and returning the next morning with peppermint water and firm optimism. Maids expertly removed wine spills and secret love letters with equal swiftness. And coachmen, well, coachmen were the first to know when a certain someone was no longer welcome at the front entrance. Yet among the most exclusive households, privacy had its layers. There were back staircases built like labyrinths and mirrored doors that led to unmarked corridors. Because heaven forbid Mrs. Astor's dog see Mrs. Vanderbilt's maid before luncheon, the truly seasoned staff learned to glide silently, to disappear like mist. They popped up only when needed, and even then, with the discretion of a magician revealing a dove. Some employers tried to instill a sense of family. Others insisted that their staff remain virtually invisible. One Boston family famously issued a memo to its servants requesting, and this is real, that they pursue their duties with the quietness of a shuffled slipper. The cook reportedly laughed so hard she burnt the biscuits. Still, for all the eccentricities they witnessed, most servants kept secrets better than a locked drawer. They knew that one misplaced whisper could mean loss of a position, or worse, awkward silence from the breakfast marmalade to the mutton at dinner. So they watched. They remembered. And sometimes, just sometimes, they jotted it all down in a notebook nobody knew they kept. Somewhere behind the curtains of drawn parlors and over-scented powder rooms, history hummed softly, unnoticed but alive, seen through the eyes of those who were never meant to see. And yet, their quiet theater was far from over, for upstairs, new guests were arriving, and with them, entirely new dramas to observe. Hidden away in the cranial maze of Gilded Age mansions, between the gilded ceilings and the cold, creaking floors, was a realm of muffled footsteps and muted glances known as below stairs. But in truth, It was never quite below anything. The servants' quarters were often tucked in the attic, an architectural irony that ensured the staff remained physically elevated but socially subterranean. Here, in this high-altitude humdrum, lived the chambermaids, the feather-wielding, schedule-keeping sentinels of silence. Their days began hours before even the earliest of family yawns. To wake a chambermaid at dawn was a bit like waking a ghost, already gone, already working. Each morning, before sunrise had the nerve to pierce the heavy velvet drapes, chambermaids embarked on what can only be described as a stealth clean. There was to be no rattling of coal buckets, no clinking of candlesticks, no evidence that the house didn't quietly tidy itself while the Vanderbilts sprawled elegantly in dreams of Venetian gondolas and social ascendance. To clean a Gilded Age bedroom was to navigate a treasure map of aristocratic quirks. You'd find hairbrushes mounted with real ivory, combs with enough tortoiseshell to make a marine biologist cry, and the pièce de résistance, a chamber pot, sometimes gilded, sometimes porcelain blue, often ominously unemptied. Now you might think a chamber pot used atop an imported Persian carpet would lead to scandal, or at least a severe scolding from the rug. But no, the pot was simply another fixture in the domestic dance. A chambermaid emptied it with the sort of hardened dignity that only someone who's seen a Rockefeller in flannel nightwear can muster, while chambermaids scrubbed and dusted with the efficiency of a Swiss watch. They also absorbed a drift of secrets. Pillow talk, the accidental hum of gossip through half-open doors, quarrels that started in whispers and ended in name drops. Oh yes, they heard it all. But here's the cozy twist. Most of them, by silent agreement or sheer professional disinterest, kept what they heard tucked under their caps. That is, unless a situation was dire or potentially amusing enough to dramatize in the laundry room later. Speaking of the laundry room, it deserves its own reverent sigh. It was a place of steam and linen, where white gloves were boiled back to life and handkerchiefs, sorted by monogram, formed slow-drying mosaics of inherited wealth. Now let's meander into the chambers of Madame Helena van Rensselaer von Butterfield. Her bedroom was a reputable thicket of silk cushions and too many mirrors. Rumor among the chambermaids held that she never looked directly at her reflection, only out of the corner of her eye, lest she risk catching her own ambition unfiltered. Madame Helena had a habit of changing her dress for every mood, and she experienced no fewer than 8 moods by noon. Silks for quiet contempt, velvets for high amusement, and if she was feeling particularly generous, a trembling pastel lace that suggested she might refrain from suing her neighbor over incorrectly pruned hedges. Her maid, Liesel, an Austrian émigré with majestic eyebrows, had memorized the ritual of dressing Madame into what was, essentially, fortified fashion. Corsets cinched like ancient architecture, petticoats layered like geological strata, and shoes so impractical they might have been sculpted rather than stitched. What few upstairs guests ever realized was that each ensemble of taffeta and tragedy had to be cleaned, pressed, and obsessionally buttoned by the anonymous hands of people like Liesel, who quietly wished the sleeves were a few inches shorter and the lady a few decibels quieter. Between tasks, Liesel could sometimes be found with the other. Chambermaids, sipping weak tea in chipped cups, their cheeks pink from heat and habit. They spoke in snippets, sometimes in English, sometimes not, and always in the code of the underherd. And so, the shuttered world of bedrooms came and went, with chambermaids moving like shadows through satin and sighs, obeying bells they never rang, and gently slipping secrets into the silent history of the house. As dusk gently settled against the alabaster columns and the last pillow was fluffed, a different kind of drama began to stir, one that simmered, not in the bedrooms, but in the kitchens below, deep in the service wing of a Newport mansion so large it required a map. A place existed where secrets floated like steam, rising through cracks in the floorboards, curling around pots of consommé, and lingering in the folds of linen aprons. The mansion's kitchen was not just for preparing French sauces with names more slippery than the sauces themselves. It was, for all intents and delicious purposes, the observed eye of the household hurricane. Now, let's step inside that kitchen. Carefully, please. Don't trip over the cat. Every kitchen had a cat, ostensibly to rid the pantry of mice, though Solomon, the current feline in residence, held more meetings with dairymaids than he did confrontations with rodents. We won't judge him. The work of a Gilded Age Mauser was, like so many titles among the staff, largely ceremonial. The kitchen clanged with life from before daybreak. Enormous copper pots glowed like bronze trophies. The floor sloped rather ominously in one corner, blamed on a minor earthquake, though Mrs. Dumfrey, the pastry cook, insisted it was caused by the disproportionate weight of the family's cheesecake orders. And above it all, presiding like a queen in a kingdom of beurre blanc, was Madame Léonie Beaufort, imported from Paris at the cost of a small vineyard. She did not tolerate overboiled asparagus or Englishmen attempting French. Sique pronunciation. Madame spoke in a mixture of French, scolding, and butter. Last week she had thrown a wooden spoon at young Robert, the kitchen boy, for sautéing mushrooms with le patience of stagnant milk. Robert, who was still learning his way around a carrot, took it as a badge of honor and described the event, repeatedly and with flair, at all meal breaks. And about those servants' meal breaks, here's a curious fact. While dinner upstairs featured 10 courses, foie gras, and an ice sculpture of Neptune playing the piccolo, the staff usually ate roasted root vegetables and boiled mystery. And yet, they dined with gusto, because what mattered more than the food was the stories told between bites. You see, it was in the kitchen that servants pieced together the jigsaw puzzle of upstairs life. They knew, for example, that Miss Lillian changed her wardrobe 4 times a day, but only wore 2 of them out of the house. They deduced, through crumbs, missing eclairs, and whispers from a footman suspiciously fond of eavesdropping, that she spent the other outfit hours hiding in the map room, eating stolen pastries and reading romantic novels about pirates with suspiciously good dental hygiene. Chef Léonie, of course, pretended indifference to all this, but had strong opinions on ship captains who lacked basic flossing realism. Ridicule, she would mutter, while flambeing a roast so thoroughly it required insurance papers. Downstairs, time passed not by clock but by clang. A single brass dinner bell, polished by someone named Harold, who claimed to be the least appreciated bell handler in American history, marked the start of formal dining upstairs. At that ring, the kitchen erupted into choreography. Sauces strained, vegetables paraded, birds trussed so tightly it gave the butler phrasing ideas. Ah, the butler, Mr. Winthrop, ever serene above stairs, a cold-glazed untouchable. But in the kitchen, back behind the meat safe and the vinegar, our shelf, he let his monocle slip just slightly. He hadn't smiled in public since 1873, yet here he allowed himself a quiet chuckle at Robert's mushroom misfortunes, and once, quite shockingly, sang a brief verse of a drinking song from Oxford. It was a Tuesday. Spirits were high. The pot roast had turned out unusually sentimental. So many little dignities lived inside that kitchen. A sugar bowl polished purely out of pride. A recipe scrawled in the margins of a prayer book. A teaspoon engraved, secretly and personally, for a cook who once fed a queen, though no one knew which queen, or if she'd meant the reigning monarch, or someone from the billiards club. They say the heart of a home is its hearth, and in this cavernous mansion, the hearth was stocked with stories, simmered low, never quite shared all at once. The servants, ever watchful, knew the difference between a burned sauce and a broken heart. The latter was harder to scrape from the pan. It was only fitting, then, that on certain winter evenings, the fireplaces in the grand dining room above roared to life from wood carried in by unwatched hands. And as the mistress raised her glass and guests cheered the extravagance of the night's menu, a certain calm descended below. Another meal complete. Another set of secrets safely sliced between courses. And speaking of secrets, there was one room in the mansion where servants rarely entered, and when they did, they never quite spoke of it the same again. The silver clink of a grapefruit spoon striking Wedgwood china echoed faintly through the breakfast rooms of Newport, where ladies in taffeta discussed nothing of importance, and footmen learned more gossip clearing plates than debutantes did over 6 seasons in society. But far below those sun-drenched parlours, in the hushed shadows of the servant corridors, another kind of intelligence network was in constant motion. It didn't wear satin gloves, and it most certainly didn't receive engraved invitations. These were the ever-watchful eyes and well-trained ears of the household staff, the bootman and the butlers, the second parlour-maid and the cook's assistant, who knew every secret because they had walked through every door no one else noticed. Somewhere between polishing the rosewood balustrades and starching a gentleman's detachable collar, the staff had mastered the art of invisibility, and invisibility, as it turns out, is excellent for eavesdropping. Nowhere was this truer than in the music rooms. Yes, the grand ballrooms had their dazzle, and don't get me wrong, we all enjoy a chandelier or 6, but it was the music rooms that held a quieter, more whimsical kind of chaos. Here, in rooms soundproofed with velvet drapes and moral ambiguity, wealthy patrons dabbled in minor scandals cloaked in sonatas. You see, hiring a private music tutor during the Gilded Age was fashionable for any self-respecting millionaire who wanted to project continental sophistication. But despite the highbrow ambitions, many of these tutors were little more than well-dressed distractions with foreign accents and questionable flirtation ethics. They'd play Chopin with one eye on the sheet music and another on the lady of the house, the one with a faint fainting condition and an affection for Hungarian composers. Of course, the servants saw it all. The wink exchanged before a nocturne, the slightly too long applause after practice, the way Lady Avery's perfume grew mysteriously stronger every Tuesday at 3 p.m. when Herr Klein arrived with his violin case and bilingual smile. The junior footman, Gerald, who technically wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the music room, developed a near-academic fascination with these weekly interludes. From his makeshift observation post behind a potted ficus, he maintained detailed mental notes that could rival any musicologist's dissertation. He estimated, for example, that Lady Avery's grasp of piano, technique improved in direct proportion to the proximity of Herr Klein's elbows. Naturally, the drama wasn't limited to romantic entanglements. Some patrons took their musical ambitions very seriously, terrifyingly so. During one memorable week in 1896, the matriarch of the Whitcomb family insisted upon hosting a salon concert for 13 invited guests, none of whom particularly liked each other or the oboe. She hired a quartet of flautists who had never met and expected them to perform Rimsky-Korsakov's Flight of the Bumblebee in perfect harmony, after lunch and on an empty stomach. The kitchen staff, meanwhile, observed a growing tension not only in the music department, but in the selection of petit fours. The pastry chef nearly defected over a dispute involving candied violets. A scuffle broke out over marzipan swans. The night of the concert, the flautists finished their performance 47 seconds early. It was the only mercy offered to the guests, who sat rigidly, through it all, pretending not to crave a strong sherry and a stronger exit. But for the staff, moments like these offered small, illicit joys, gossamer threads of absurdity to pass along during silver polishing. They built legends out of botched operettas and flute-induced meltdowns, spoken in whispered tones across laundry lines and between the clink of decanters. Even the housekeeper, normally as rigid as a mahogany armoire, cracked a smile one morning as she heard the scullery maid humming part of the Bumblebee. "Don't ever say music isn't educational," she muttered with a smirk, not looking up from her ledger. And so the servants continued their quiet symphony of observation, moving to the rhythm of routines and romance, of scandals and scherzos. They were background figures in the overture of Gilded Age opulence, but they heard every tuning note and every false crescendo, because in truth, behind the closed doors, the music never really stopped. One hallways, muffled strains overlapped with another's hushed conversation. The world upstairs spun on melody and manners, and downstairs, something unseen, perhaps entertainment, perhaps empathy, softly scored each step through the manor's undercurrent of secrets. Now, as the final chords from the impromptu clarinet solo fade into the velvet dusk of memory, let us drift softly down the corridor to another place, where linens are stamped, but reputations are not. Of all the silver-polished corners of the Gilded Age mansion, none were quite as slippery as the truth, or what passed for it, behind tightly embroidered velvet drapes. Because when it came to gossip, the help didn't merely pass it around like scones at afternoon tea. They curated it, seasoned it, and served it up in hushed tones over coal buckets and chamber pots. And nowhere was this underground newsletter as lively as in the servants' hall, that dimly lit basement confessional where butlers, maids, and footmen peeled. A back society's lacquered facade, like peeling wallpaper in a summer home. Now, imagine this space. Long wooden table, mismatched chairs scraped from second-hand aristocracy, and the air fragrant with starch, soap, and subtle schadenfreude. The footman Philip, slightly deaf in one ear but still the fastest eavesdropper in 3 counties, was the undisputed editor-in-chief of this whispering post. He claimed to lip-read arguments between the lady of the house and her milliner through a closed window. Did he embellish? Absolutely. Was anyone going to challenge a man who knew where everyone's love letters and laudanum were hidden? Not on your life. The upstairs life sparkled. But downstairs, oh, it shimmered in a sturdier, more ironic sort of way. Take, for example, the grand dinner parties that dominated the social calendar like slow-moving parades of pate and posture, while society's elite chattered confidently above lace tablecloths, spouting opinions they'd inherited. Like their silver, the servants were 2 floors down, mimicking their voices with alarming accuracy. Annie, the second housemaid, was particularly gifted at impressions. She once so perfectly reenacted Mrs. Vanderploom's monologue on the moral shortcomings of people who use artificial flowers. The entire servants' hall erupted into scandalized laughter. For one glorious week, servants from neighboring houses snuck over to catch her act after supper. Someone carved theatre do spoons into the corner of the rough-hewn mantelpiece, and no one dared sand it off. But gossip, like drapes in a drafty ballroom, had a way of billowing into real trouble. There was the unfortunately memorable incident with the monogrammed glove, an exquisitely embroidered lady's glove, initialed in golden thread too fine to be mistaken, turned up under the billiards table. The housemaid found it while retrieving a cue ball that had taken a curious detour. Said glove was most definitely not the earned property of Mrs. Vanderploom, whose hands were famously wide and ungloved. Like a well-fed pianist, the butler once noted. Philip, of course, traced the glove directly to Countess Dolinska, a house guest from Warsaw with a fondness for perfume and painfully sharp snuff boxes. Servants speculated. Was it an affair? Was it a fencing duel gone scandalously intimate? No one knew for sure. But tea breaks that week crackled with possibility. The real intrigue, though, wasn't just in the scandal. It was in how expertly the staff choreographed their role as invisible spectators of scandal. Amid strict hierarchies and endless rules about how many paces behind one must walk, based on whether a guest was minor nobility or majorly irritating, servants honed the art of presence without attention. They became shadows that memorized dinner seating orders in real time, learned that Lady Houghton's mood could be gauged by the tilt of her lorgnette, and clocked every tryst, tiff, and tremble behind the grand doorways of the drawing rooms, all without ever speaking first, unless spoken to. And yet they spoke. Oh, they spoke. Just not where polite company could hear. Laughter and conspiracies swirled behind pantry doors, while feet shuffled in coded clacks and squeaks, alerting one another to approaching footsteps like a Morse code of slippers and servant bells. That delicate knowingness of everything and nothing at the same time was a distinct skill. It was, frankly, a sort of espionage with more feather dusters and good posture. Beneath the surface of opulence, it was the human exchange of foolishness, empathy, and third-hand information that gave the Gilded Age its peculiar intimacy and its absurdity. As the lamps downstairs dimmed and the kitchen's last copper pot ceased its midnight shine, a quiet would settle in. Only the ticking of the servant's clock, inherited from some lesser cousin of a baron, kept time with their secrets, murmured to one, another like bedtime stories in whispers, too soft for any gramophone. And somewhere, among the cobwebbed quiet of servants' quarters and the half-broken settee they all pretended they didn't sit on, a different sort of mystery was taking shape, one less gossipy and far more golden, one that would glint its way into the next evening, carried not by lords or ladies, but by the small hands that polished their banisters. Let's slip quietly now to the other side of the house, where something curious awaited beneath the dusty folds of a forgotten parlour curtain. Peter, the third footman at Whitestone Hall, had one unwavering ambition. One day, he dreamed of being promoted to second footman, or in moments of reckless hope, perhaps even first. He had the straight back for it, and his gloved hands looked elegant even when polishing 36 forks with vinegar paste and misplaced existentialism. But the invisible theatre of a Gilded Age mansion extended far beyond a forks, in shininess. It was in this world of quiet hustle and muffled grandeur that Peter witnessed something absurd even by upstairs standards: the secret war of the dinner napkins. You see, Mrs. Willoughby Bartleby, Whitestone's formidable mistress, held the curious belief that the correct napkin fold revealed one's soul. And not only one's soul, but also one's political leanings, number of ship voyages taken, and likelihood of marrying someone from the Vermont branch of the family, which she considered slightly unrefined. Thus began an unofficial ceremony known to the staff as the Napkin Games, every Thursday afternoon, just before the weekly dinner designed to impress and intimidate arriving railway tycoons and debutantes with ankles deemed too enthusiastic. The head butler, Mr. Pennythorn, would summon the footman to the linen closet. There, in shushed urgency, he'd declare, "Tonight, it's the bishop's hat," and then vanish into the corridor like a mysterious valet in a novella. Now, the bishop's hat was a sacred and complex fold, believed to have originated from the dark summer when the Bartlebys tried hosting Hungarian diplomats, and nothing translated well except the wine. Peter's job, as third footman, was to pre-fold approximately 40 napkins into these ecclesiastical origami shapes before the guests arrived. But Mrs. Bartleby, ever the vigilant matron, had recently become bored of geometry and, on a whim powered by an alarming number of figs, decreed a new napkin fold, the Swan of Prosperity. This was not a fold known to history, or logic, or physics. It involved 6 pleats, a twist, and a gentle shaping of what one might generously come to call a beak. The result resembled not a swan, but perhaps a confused spoon. Nevertheless, Mrs. Bartleby insisted it heralded a golden future, and absolutely no one must sit down without one. Servants who failed were reassigned to polish the infamous 18-piece asparagus, tongue set until they repented. Peter, bolstered by lemon-scented starch and sheer youthful optimism, decided to master it. And for 3 dazzling minutes, he thought he had. Alas, the senior footman clucked his tongue and asked gently, "Peter, is this one wincing?" In truth, it was. So late into the evening, while the string quartet prepared their repertoire of mildly scandalous waltzes, Peter hovered behind the great mahogany table, ensuring that no guest accidentally insulted international economics by ruining their prosperity swan. Because once seated, no one, under any circumstances, was to notice their napkins might have necks of uneven length. It simply wasn't done. From behind the potted palm trees, strategically placed to hide the scurrying of butlers, whispers floated through the air. Mrs. Lavington's swan just collapsed. Viscount Denby is now wearing his as a cravat. The French ambassador keeps calling it la tristesse du tissu. The servants, a stifled laughter in their waistcoats. The guests, unknowing, sipped consommé under gazes of ancestral portraits, that seemed to judge all fabric failures harshly. Yet amid this subtle chaos, Peter earned quiet admiration from the cook, Mrs. Bletchley, who observed that he'd managed an actual curve to Lord Bartholomew's swan neck. "Takes a steady hand and a dash of lunacy," she whispered. "You'll go far." Peter blushed, then bumped into the dessert trolley on his way out. Pistachio soufflé leaned dangerously, but dignity was preserved. Such were the backstage dramas of the Gilded Age, not revolutions, but revolt in folds of linen. The servants saw all, remembered most, and spoke only when the silver was safely locked away. A house like Whitestone had many secrets, but few so delicately absurd as the ones folded at 6:55 p.m. and whisked away before the brandy arrived. Now, if you listen closely, the silver is clinking. Someone's whispering about a misplaced pheasant, and the scullery maid, it seems, has stumbled upon something hidden behind the wine crates, something that shouldn't be there at all. If you happen to be employed below stairs in a Gilded Age mansion, and by below stairs, we don't just mean socially, but often physically, geographically, and metaphorically, you would have quickly learned that your employer's most complicated relationship wasn't with their spouse, or their lawyer, or even their slightly unhinged cousin trying to secure a European title. No, it was with the chair. Now, not just any chair, mind you. This was the chair, capital letters woven right into the upholstery, so to speak. It was a hand-carved piece of opulent discomfort, imported from Florence, or possibly Kansas with an Italian name. Laden with gold leaf, scowling cherubs, and the kind of cushions that looked plush until you sat down, at which point they attacked your lumbar with the ferocity of a disillusioned butler. Lady Astorbilt, whose name had once been Astor before clever marital maneuvering added a few more syllables of social weight, had her own chair. It lived in the music room, a room she endured once a week while pretending not to hear her niece slaughter Chopin. Only the second parlour maid was allowed to dust it. Only the butler was allowed to glance at it. And all the household manuals. Yes, there were internal training manuals for some Gilded Age estates, logistics, referred to it simply as Item A1, high priority furniture not to be sat upon. Once, a new footman made the fatal error of leaning momentarily against the chair while dreaming of his lunch break. He was transferred the next day to Pittsburgh. This sort of ceremonial reverence for furniture was not uncommon in households where the aesthetic ideal leaned somewhere between Roman imperial excess and is that gold on the chamber pot? But beyond the furniture cult, servants often bore witness to much stranger household totems. Take, for example, the Edison phonograph incident. In 1890, Mr. Bartholomew Winch, Bar for short, but only when he wasn't listening, attended a demonstration of Mr. Edison's newest audio contraption. With the evangelical fervor of a man who'd already electrified his horse stables before wiring a single bedroom, he returned home to his Fifth Avenue manor and declared to the staff, "I shall now live forever on wax." The housekeeper blinked. The parlour-maid dropped a silver tray. And Mrs. Winch was notably silent, except for a slight, pained expression that might have indicated either resignation or indigestion. Mr. Winch then proceeded to record approximately 147 monologues on various wax cylinders, including one droning 10-minute reflection on the subtle difference between port and Madeira. It became the secret sport of the manservants to sneak into the library when he was away and play the cylinders backward in search of spiritual messages. Or failing that, an admission that he couldn't actually tell the difference between port and Madeira. Meanwhile, the kitchen staff bore witness to even stranger rituals. Gilded Age diets, at least for those who weren't cooking them, had a curious ambition. Food was at once a display of wealth, a test of digestive resilience, and a demonstration of sheer gastronomic theatre. Menus for a Tuesday luncheon could easily include oyster consommé, sweetbreads in puff pastry, 2 kinds of duck, 4 kinds of pudding, and naturally, a sculpted fruit tower taller than the person who made it. The night kitchen, staffed around the clock for fear of sudden hunger at 3 a.m., witnessed some of the most poetic culinary raids in history. Lady Astorbilt, once caught tiptoeing with a spoon through the icebox in her corset and pearls, whispered what would become an inside joke among the cooks for years. "I require bread pudding and discretion in equal measure." Even more telling was what didn't get eaten. There are records, handwritten in the housekeeper's log in impeccable cursive, of entire roasts, trifles and aspics prepared, presented, praised by guests, and then whisked away untouched. Celebration through waste, the apex of aristocratic hospitality. But perhaps the servants' strangest insight of all came not from watching their employers live, but from watching them pretend. Pretend they were always composed. Pretend every party went smoothly. Pretend they never needed urgent help with a dislocated bustle gown after an overly enthusiastic turn through the waltz. In truth, beneath the satin gloves and Swarovski-studded slippers, the Gilded Age elite were only human, terribly so. Missed notes at the piano. A cough snuck into the wrong silence. A letter hidden instead of answered. All quietly witnessed by the people cleaning the ink from their desks and polishing the glasses they'd dropped in speeches. But the night was creeping further into stillness now. The great chandeliers had dimmed. Only the faint hum of distant phonograph recordings echoed softly in the parlor. And as the mansion settled into its plush hush, something curious stirred upstairs. A shadow, a whisper, or perhaps a secret to be discovered next. In the grandest drawing rooms of the Gilded Age, where the wallpaper often cost more than a servant's yearly wage, and the chandeliers loomed like glittering threats from above, there lived a peculiar sort of reverence for the idea of refinement. But polish too much silver, and even elegance begins to sweat. At least that's what Marie believed. She was a lady's maid at the Whitmore estate in Newport, and on one warm September afternoon, she pressed her ear to yet another intricately carved door and heard something truly dreadful. "But Geraldine, the pâté is simply too pâté." The voice belonged to Mrs. Whitmore, who, draped in violet velvet like a royal eggplant, had been engaged in a 3-day war of attrition over the canapé selections for her charity cotillion. As Marie quietly catalogued the culinary conflict from the shadowed servants' hall, she tried not to sigh. That sigh might have echoed up the dumbwaiter shaft, and then, heaven forbid, they'd all be summoned to weigh in on goose liver logistics. These were the types of great domestic dramas that unfolded behind silk-paneled doors and baccarat crystal. They concerned themselves not with mortality or mores, but with the socially ruinous dare of serving shrimp out of season. Servants were not just eyewitnesses to these atmospheric absurdities. They were participants, buffers, and, in Marie's case, secret chroniclers. She kept a habit of writing down each overheard phrase that reached a certain altitude of ridiculousness. For example, what if someone else wears heliotrope? It's the morning flower Geraldine. That one made it into the book. Helio under H. Below stairs, the domestic staff often found themselves staging informal reenactments of such scenes, triggered by too many port decanters and a mutual love of satire. There was Mrs. Henley, the cook, who could mimic Mrs. Whitmore's dramatic whisper in a way that made you forget she had ever baked a tart in her life. They performed these sketches not for cruelty, but as a form of occupational therapy. When your job involved starching 56 pleats into one petticoat, humor became your last line of defense. Of course, discretion was the true coin of the realm. Servants might entertain each other with vocal impressions and reinterpretations of emotional meltdowns involving parasol ribbons, but never in front of a guest. The scullery maid named Dot once accidentally giggled when someone mentioned aspic. She was sent to polish the third-floor finials for 3 days, an unskilled labor punishment, yes, but perhaps the world's most punishing cardio. Being a servant in the Gilded Age required a hybrid of skills: the emotional intelligence of a diplomat, the stealth of a cat burglar, and the memory of a stage actor, all used in service of preserving the illusion that the household ran itself, when in reality, It ran on human backs and steel nerves. Sometimes the absurdity of it all peeked through the ferns and curtains. There was, for instance, the matter of Sir Buttons. He was a prized Yorkshire Terrier who had his own velvet chaise. One blistering July afternoon, under orders from Mrs. Whitmore, Sir Buttons had to be serenaded by a local violinist for 20 minutes a day because he thrives on Schubert. Naturally, it was Marie who escorted the musician up, held the dog's paw gently, apparently to steady his vibrations, and stood silently in the room as a grown man played a sonata to a nonplussed terrier whose only comment on the performance was an impressive nap. If music soothed the savage beast, it certainly didn't wake this one up. These incidents stitched together the real fabric of mansion life, a life punctuated by great ceremonial flourishes above the stairs and soft-footed pragmatism below. Every bell pull above was echoed by a knowing sigh below. Every orchid arranged in an absurdly narrow vase had been selected, pruned, and dusted by a quietly expert hand. But in the deep blue twilight, when the last gas lamp was dimmed and the last corset unhooked, the servants finally claimed a few secret minutes to themselves. A spot of tea, a tin of biscuits if they were lucky. They'd recount the day like soldiers exhaling after battle, only their battlefield was one of lace, cutlery, and improbable dietary restrictions. And as Marie eased into her attic bed that evening, her notebook tucked safely beneath her pillow, she thought about how she could describe Sir Buttons's expression upon hearing a particularly dramatic crescendo. Perhaps decidedly unimpressed, she scribbled before drifting off to sleep. Tomorrow, no doubt, would bring another scandal involving the chandelier's chain length or a near duel over ivory versus ecru table linen. But tonight, all was quiet, except for the dumbwaiter, which let out one last sleepy clank, as if settling in for its own midnight dreams. And stirring in another house not far from Newport, the butler prepared for what would be the most curious Wednesday morning of his professional life. There was a curious thing about Gilded Age gentlemen. They loved to pretend they were outdoors, even while being very much indoors. If you were of the sort to dust the drawing room figurines at 7 o'clock sharp, you might have noticed entire libraries wallpapered with murals of alpine meadows and fishing streams. Nature, it seemed, was more tolerable when it came shellacked and odorless. But among the many peculiarities that servants witnessed, none were quite as endearing or baffling as the obsession with the indoor garden room. To the wealthy of the 1880s, merely hosting a rosebush in a pot wasn't good enough. Oh no, that would be middle class. What you needed instead was a fully integrated conservatory, preferably one visible from the breakfast nook, so you could ponder a ficus tree while contemplating your marmalade. Entire wings of East Coast homes were converted into crystalline solariums, filled with climbing vines, exotic orchids, and the unmistakable hum of rare imported bees, because even the insects had to be shipped in. And who managed these personal jungles, you may ask? Why, the gardener, of course. But not just any gardener. This was a specialized breed known as the indoor horticulturalist. Typically British, often bespectacled, and always a little sun-deprived, these masters of the miniature rainforests had their own sort of dignity. They treated the plants with the reverence one might reserve for a bishop, or at least a particularly picky dowager. One such man, Mr. Greeley, horticulturalist to the Thompsons of Newport, was known to speak to the ferns in Latin. He claimed they responded better that way. Whether or not this was scientifically sound is beside the point. The butlers gave him a wide berth and were especially careful during the full moon. What made conservatories so appealing wasn't just their aesthetic, though lounging among magnolias in your dressing gown certainly had its charms, but their utility. They became stages for social display. Luncheons held under glass ceilings gave the impression of sophistication and vigor. "Oh, Clarissa," someone might say, fanning themselves gently. "Isn't the light on the bougainvillea simply perfect this afternoon?" To which Clarissa would reply, "Yes, and I do believe it matches the aspect." But behind this botanical theatre lay a more grounded, often muddy, reality. Keeping a conservatory alive in the ever-unpredictable climate of New York or Rhode Island required a marvel of scheduling. There were watering rotations plotted with watch-like precision, temperature monitoring that rivaled a submarine control room, and constant vigilance for aphids, which were to be vanquished with the same intensity afforded to uninvited cousins at Christmas. Servants learned quickly to avoid touching anything in the garden room. More than one housemaid had her ears singed off, metaphorically, for brushing against a rare specimen from the Andes. One poor footman was sacked entirely for sneezing near the delicate Chinese camellias, which, according to rumor, had cost more than his annual salary and arrived in the country with fanfare usually reserved for royalty. And then there were the birds. Ah, yes, the aviary section of the conservatory. Because what's a jungle without a few chatty toucans? Wealthy families delighted in filling the upper rafters with feathered treasures. Canaries from Naples, finches from India, one family even boasting a talking parrot that could quote Shakespeare and nibble guests' buttons without discrimination. But for the servants, these feathered florals were less charming and more splattery. The footmen who served tea in the conservatory developed swift, serpentine serving routes and lived in constant fear of gravity's betrayal. One enterprising butler named Elias began referring to the conservatory as the Tropics of Doom, a nickname that stuck so permanently that even the family adopted it, albeit with a fond sort of amusement. And here's a little secret that never made the society pages. Many a clandestine flirtation grew beneath those leafy canopies. Parlour-maid and stable-boy, kitchen assistant and scullery lad. It was something about the filtered light and whispering palms that made stolen glances feel slightly more cinematic. Garden rooms were Edenic indeed, if one was willing to overlook the occasional shriek from a startled cockatoo. Eventually, of course, the conservatory trend faded, as trends often do when they become expensive, drafty, and prone to mosquito infestations. The ivy retreated, the glass fogged over, and the indoor trees gave way to indoor billiards instead. But for a moment in time, amidst the steam and chlorophyll and ritualistic misting of the ferns, the Gilded Age elite indulged in the thrilling illusion of being one with nature, without, of course, actually touching dirt. And just beyond the warmth of the orchids whispering quietly in their hand-blown glass corners, will tiptoe toward that most mysterious of rooms, where the china was locked up, the dust cloths had names, and the lineage of porcelain was tracked more rigorously than some family trees, as twilight painted long golden shadows across the marble halls of the Astor mansion. The fourth footman exhaled with reverence, for the dining room table had achieved its maximal splendor. Threaded linen as white as a fresh snowfall, 14 courses worth of silver flatware, aligned like a shimmering battalion, and the pièce de résistance. Central candelabra, taller than a standing corgi, polished until it might inspire philosophical reflection. It was all terribly grand, if a bit exhausting for the people expected to polish it. In the sanctum below the parlour, nestled between the coal storage and the wine cellar, the servants' quarters buzzed with quieter triumphs. One triumphant scullery maid had managed to boil an egg perfectly for the first time since Easter, and was congratulated as if she'd orchestrated a peace treaty. The butler, meanwhile, appeared in the doorway like a stern owl, clutching a clipboard filled with place assignments and notes requiring precision rivaled only by military logistics or an average game of Monopoly. Today's gathering upstairs was for a visiting prince, one of the lesser-known ones, with a name suspiciously similar to a German sausage, Herr something or the other. The servants didn't pretend to care, but the staff had learned something crucial. Minor royalty still drank like major royalty, and the resulting impromptu bath time using imported champagne was exactly the sort of detail the second parlour maid felt was worth including in her diary. The truth, of course, was that servants saw far more than they were ever supposed to. Not just silken gowns forgotten in hallways or whispered arguments between heiresses and their spineless fiancés, but real insight, all the soft, unguarded edges that spilled out far from the glitter of glittering invitations. They polished silver, but also polished secrets in silence, with gloves and discretion. Take, for instance, the peculiar pastime of Mrs. Cornelia Vanderbilt, who believed firmly that disguising herself as a servant and wandering the house anonymously was great fun and deeply educational. It was neither. It resulted mostly in dropped trays, startled screeches, and one incident wherein she accidentally found herself serving soup to her own husband, who, not recognizing her, asked for a hotter "girl next time." That one did not make it into the society papers, nor did the staff's clandestine charades night, held weekly in the laundry room, where Mrs. Vanderbilt's disguises were gleefully reenacted with exaggerated flair. Servants weren't supposed to impersonate the family, but when no one's watching and the starching's done, human nature tends to step in. And then there was the issue of the mirrors. Now, most Gilded Age households had mirrors, of course, but certain Vanderbilts installed them in such number that it was difficult to tell if you were walking into a new room or merely your own reflection. Some of these, it was muttered under breath, were two-way, invented, so claimed the footman with a flair for conspiracy, to allow curious hosts to observe their guests when they thought themselves alone. No one had real proof, but the maids always cleaned them with a wary squint, just in case the Countess of Somewhere Important was lurking on the other side, with a monocle and a notepad, judging their dusting technique. Downstairs, in the thick of cabbages being boiled and soufflés being dared into existence, the gossip flowed freely. Not malicious, mind you, just observational, like a kind-hearted public radio commentary. For instance, they admired how elegantly Mr. Carnegie crumbled under romantic pressure, and how desperately the youngest Astor son tried to impress women with his knowledge of Latin, even though he pronounced half of it like a sneeze. There was comfort, in a way, to see the mighty falter on matters of love and colds, and occasionally, a servant saw something that stayed within them forever. The third maid once spied the lady of the house, barefoot at midnight, returning from the kitchen with an entire tart in her arms and jam on her upper lip. She hadn't been weeping or scheming, just hungry. For a moment, she looked like anyone else, and for that moment, the distance between upstairs and downstairs collapsed entirely, leaving the house quiet, human, and full of pastry crumbs. Sleep crept in gently, like dusk rolling over a velvet chaise. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed twice, echoing down marbled corridors and through the hollow bones of gowns hung in armoires. The last boot was shined, the final spoon set straight. And with a sigh, the house exhaled its grandeur into the hush of night. But just beyond that hush, there lingered a bell pull, lightly trembling. A signal of something quite unexpected. Or perhaps just another secret waiting politely for a night like this. In the grand parade of Gilded Age pageantry, one guest rarely received an invitation, but always showed up anyway. Gossip. It breezed through the lilac-scented corridors of the Vanderbilts' marble mansions and curled under the parlor doors like a mischievous draught. And while the upper crust exchanged pleasantries over oysters, Rockefeller and dubious champagne, the servants exchanging coats and secrets in the cloakroom held the true encyclopedia of impropriety. Take, for instance, the scandal of Lady Evelyn's portable bidet, an exquisitely crafted porcelain contraption dispatched all the way from Paris, rumored to have once belonged to a French duchess with very high standards. The bidet caused such a stir among the third-floor chambermaids that they took turns sneaking into Lady Evelyn's suite, just to marvel at it by candlelight. Some swore it chirped when filled. Others insisted it was haunted by the ghost of a very hygienic ghost. The truth, it simply had a pressure valve that hissed under the right humidity. But this never stopped Wilma, the laundress with a talent for dramatic pauses, from telling wide-eyed kitchen boys that she once saw it levitate. Of course, gossip was currency below stairs, and nothing earned more clout than secrets of the strange rituals of the wealthy. Savvy footmen quickly learned that information was valuable, especially to other servants hoping to dodge a late-night call bell or secure the all-important privilege of serving the breakfast tray. One butler, an ex-theatre usher named Charles, had mastered the art of mood reading based solely on toast settings. If Mrs. Collingwood ordered triangle-cut toast, safe to speak. If squares, bring her tea and retreat. Melba, storm incoming, hide behind the potted fern. Despite formal etiquette manuals touting the stoicism of good help, most staff developed a sort of quiet gallows humor about the whole charade. After all, it was difficult to take Mr. Horace Winthrop seriously, as he stomped through his rose-colored marble foyer with a monocle that persistently fell into his consommé, when you saw him every morning being gently massaged with Shetland soap by his valet, while reciting affirmations his spiritual advisor had telegraphed from Boston. "I deserve success," Horace would mumble, chest deep in a perfume tub, while James, the valet, wondered quietly how much he could charge for this confession if he ever wrote a book. In the laundry rooms and sculleries, the day's absurdities were aired along with table linens. One scullery maid, 17 and named Dot, once witnessed a minor catastrophe when an irate heiress demanded all her dress buttons be replaced because someone's fingers had touched them with common energy. Dot had to remove 87 pearl buttons with a pair of nail scissors and attach 87 new ones, all identical to the untrained eye. But this, according to the footman who delivered tea trays upstairs, was simply about the heiress trying to delay a dinner party that included a suitor who reminded her of an unfortunate poet she once met in Newport. Servants developed unspoken alliances, trading useful details like croupiers at a clandestine game. A kitchen maid might tip off the upstairs housemaid that Lady Florence had had one of her headaches, which translated into an imminent schedule shuffle. Breakfast in bed. No embroidery. Guests. 3 lukewarm compress cloths and a quietly plucked harp somewhere in the background. This impressed the visitors, who later gushed about Lady Florence's elegant air of delicate introspection, without realizing the whole effect was powered by 13 exhausted staff members and a small forest's worth of eucalyptus oil. And yes, occasionally a story would slip beyond the mansion walls. A certain senator's wife once hosted an opera singer and accidentally served smoked mackerel instead of pâté. The servants recalled her panic, the rushing of silver domes back to the kitchen, and the frantic fashioning of an entirely new meal, ending with the opera singer receiving a single candied violet and declaring it the best performance she'd ever tasted. Naturally, the senator's wife claimed credit, but in truth, it was Clara the cook who'd remembered the old family trick. Distract aristocrats with small edible flowers. Works every time. As the nights lengthened and the season turned toward autumn, the inner workings of these grand estates continued in their quiet absurdity. With each passing hour, under candlelight and clattering trays, the servants saw the world through silver keyholes and linen closets, bearing witness to the true theatre of the elite. And somewhere on the second floor, a valet tiptoed past a snoring congressman wrapped in mink and humiliation, while dreaming of the next perfectly polished dinner bell. Through the hush of white-gloved corridors and behind the mahogany doors of high society, a quiet revolution brewed. Not political, not even personal, really, but one of pocket strategy. For the servants of the Gilded Age, discretion wasn't just policy. It was survival, and occasionally, profit. By the 1890s, the servants of sprawling Newport mansions or Fifth Avenue palaces had developed their own taxonomy of the wealthy. The loud but tactile, usually a Vanderbilt, the quiet and suspicious, likely an Astor, and the occasionally panic-stricken, prone to mysteriously missing their brooches, only to find them half an hour later pinned to the wrong shoulder. Servants often learned more about their employers in a week than their employers knew about themselves in a lifetime. Take, for instance, the art of letter interception. No, not for blackmail. Goodness no. Blackmail was terribly inelegant. Instead, it was all about preemptive prevention, particularly when Lady Gwendolen caught the sparkle-eyed attention of a baronet with gambling debts and a German shepherd named Prancer. Footmen perfected the side-eyed glance, the delicate involvement in post-dinner correspondence sorting, the accidental misplacement of an envelope. Rumors could be stalled, engagements salvaged, and dogs uninvited by a well-placed silver salver, and just the right amount of footstep timing. But perhaps nowhere was the art of quiet knowing more refined than in the dressing rooms of the elite. Ladies' maids and valets knew not only what their mistresses wore, but why they wore it. Every lace insertion and silk panel a clue to that evening's objective. A pale aquamarine gown meant a certain marquis had RSVP'd. A freshly stitched pair of kid gloves in midnight blue. Lady Hargrave's hands needed to be busier at whist than in someone else's topcoat. Truth be told, more romantic entanglements were thwarted by hairpins than by scandal sheets. A well-timed observation. I believe, madam, you've accidentally tucked Lord Dunleavy's monogrammed handkerchief into your reticule. Could steer a whole affair back onto the straight and boring. Downstairs, in the warmth and coal dust of servant halls, evening tea was paired with tales exchanged like currency. Not in malice, just mutual admiration for the theatrical effortings of the eccentrically rich. Like Mrs. Penelope Blanchard of Beacon Hill, who was convinced her cat, Huxley, could commune with the dead via Morse code tapping his tail on the fainting couch. Or Lord Hollingsworth, who requested his valet address him in flawless Italian, despite neither being able to speak the language. Nothing at all would be said, just long, dramatic gestures and vowels. But of course, secrets weren't always born of comedy. In the nurseries and convalescent chambers, servants bore witness to the softer vulnerabilities of their employers, the night terrors of men returned from distant intrigues, the deep sighs of women who'd read too much Shelley and not enough prenuptial. It was in these quiet hours that staff became something else. Not merely witnesses, but quietly indispensable scaffolding to the pillars of excess rising above them. Every now and then, one of them, an undercook, a coachman's son, a candle trimmer with a flair for sonnets, would abscond into the fog, move west, change their name to something like Stanton or Heath, and retire 50 years later with a tidy sum in Dubuque. But most stayed, and some even rose through their own hierarchies, from scullery maid to kitchen maid, from valet to butler, each step an upgrade not just in wages, but in access, the gilded ladder climbing not toward opulence, but toward knowledge. And therein lay the luxury servants truly understood, awareness. Not in a grand conspiratorial sense. No one was plotting over tea and toast. Not often, anyway. But knowing a household's rhythms, its artifacts, its heartbeats, and its tendency to lose cufflinks precisely 7 minutes before the opera started, was a form of artistry all its own. Their lives wove beneath the wallpaper of history, tucked behind the brocade curtains and beneath the oil portrait of someone's disappointed great-uncle. They were the ones who watched the chandelier sputter during a speech, who handed over the lorgnette at just the right moment, who knew when a sigh meant affection, or just indigestion. And in the hush of late night, after the fires had turned to embers and the ballroom had quieted, servants gathered their trays, folded the silks, and whispered stories to one another. Stories of those who commanded rooms, but not always themselves, of jewels and letters and shoes one size too small. But there was one more tale, tucked in the linen drawer behind the monogrammed hand towels, perhaps the most delicate secret of all. One best shared. Next, as the gas lamps flickered low in the hallways of those Gilded Age palaces, and the sound of midnight carriage wheels faded into the pillow of velvet dusk, the servant corridors slowly quieted. There, in worn slippers and patched waistcoats, the real chroniclers of high society's secrets yawned into chamber pots and exchanged one last bit of gossip before tomorrow's tarnished silver would need polishing again. Upstairs, all was illusion. Feathers and diamonds, and the faintest trace of lavender, eager to outlast the reality of sweat. But downstairs, things were considerably more honest. Uncombed, unfiltered, and occasionally unbuttoned. The servants had seen everything. and remembered with the kind of detailed precision that only comes from pairing a sharp mind with abject boredom and stiff starch collars. And in the end, what they observed wasn't scandal for scandal's sake. No, it was a kind of accidental anthropology, a study of a tribe where dressing for dinner counted as cardio, and forgetting one's opera gloves could spark an international incident, or at least a very heated letter to the editor of Town and Country. Take, for instance, the ritual of the bedtime brandy. Lady Astor, not that Astor, her cousin, who was both richer and less restrained, insisted upon a single warm snifter brought to her boudoir each evening at precisely 11:15. If it arrived at 11:12, she was insulted. If at 11:17, she wept. The footman assigned to this Sisyphean task went prematurely grey, kept diaries spanning years of brandy-related complaints, and eventually emigrated to Canada, where he lived happily, never once pouring another drink. And then there was the matter of secret pets. Oh yes, while society guests cooed over amateur chamber orchestras and hand-painted tea sets, more than one servant had the honour and discomfort of rescuing dachshunds from toilets and retrieving scandalously bald parrots from chandeliers. One groundskeeper at a Newport mansion took in a raccoon, whom he dressed in doll's clothing and referred to as Master William. The raccoon outlived 3 footmen and developed a taste for lemon curd and minor toe nibbling. Of course, secrets could curl more quietly too. In the creased linens and overlooked corners, the servants catalogued quiet sadnesses. The heiress, who threw dinner parties to avoid the silence of her own mind. The baron who raced horses because he couldn't win at marriage. The twins who had to pretend they weren't twins because society frowned upon identical novelty. These weren't scandals. They were sighs with pearl cufflinks. By the end of it, many servants knew the families they served better than their own reflection. They anticipated tantrums like weather patterns. They could identify each child's footsteps on the marble floor. One laundress could match buttons to guests with unsettling accuracy, once claiming she could sniff out a Vanderbilt from his starch alone. She was never formally challenged. As electric lights began to replace gas, and the children of butlers became taxi drivers or librarians or, to much whispered alarm, artists, the houses changed. The grand staircases grew quiet. Ballrooms hosted fewer waltzes and more echoes. And in the attics of memory, the secrets settled in layers, soft as lint and almost as invisible. But the servants didn't disappear. They became oral historians at supper tables. They told their grandchildren about the night the Duchess filled her corset with hamsters for warmth. Or when the Countess shouted, "Vive la République!" during a costume ball, not realizing what the phrase meant and definitely not caring. As sleep slips in and wraps its velvet arms around you, perhaps it's comforting to know that the truth of that era wasn't all gold leaf and corset boning. Underneath the marble and manageably mad wallpaper patterns, there were people, confused, extravagant, oddly tender people, making it up as they went along. And behind them, just out of sight, always watching with a raised eyebrow, and a teacup that may or may not have been pilfered from the drawing room, stood the servants, documenting everything in silence, with a knowing look, and shoes one size too tight. So now, as the lights dim and the last of the brandy vanishes into dreams, rest, dear listener. The mists of history are quiet tonight, and the gossip has gone to bed.